Good afternoon, good day, everyone. And my name is Kristan. And for today's episode, I'm going to be speaking completely in English because my guest today is a foreigner, Mr. John Dang, who's actually one of the best investment vloggers here in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia. And today we're going to be talking about John. I want to get your perspective on this. Is the oil crisis happening, the Iran war, and how it affects us locally, and how we should be protecting our investments and making investments here in the Philippines. And I want to hear your perspective as a foreigner, and let's compare it to how locals should be investing. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me here. Watch your show, but I always put it on Translate, Google Translate on your show. So let me answer your question. I think the Iran war has really kind of woken us up to how this isn't the first time, by the way. So since the 1970s till now, I did a lot of research about this. We've had 5 major oil crises where we had a major spike in oil. And it really, every time it happened, the peso devalued against the dollar anywhere between 10 to 20%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it never really bounces back. So I'll give you a little bit of perspective. In 1973, I think our peso, we had 6.7 peso to a dollar.
Okay.
Now, the recent crisis, it reached up to 60.
Yes.
And the major reason for that is because we're a net importer. So we import all of our oil and we have to buy those imports in dollars. Why? Because of the petrodollar.
Right.
And so this whole Iran crisis, I almost feel like the US kind of walked into this trap, you know? And this is actually favoring China right now because of all this, because of the oil crisis around the world. It's really hurting economies like the Philippines, Korea, South Korea, Japan. All these countries in Asia are a major net importer of oil, and they have to buy in dollars. And so that hits their inflation rates way more than the US printing $40 trillion of national debt, right?
Wow.
So another way to look at it, right? So what's a good standard of unit economics? Gold, right?
Okay.
Gold has always been kind of like the standard unit economics of wealth. Back in 1970, gold was like $35.
Okay.
Right? And now it's like $4,600 or something like that, right? And so the currency increase was something like 135x, right?
Right.
But if you take the peso in 1970, I mean, if you look at gold in terms of the price of pesos in 1970, it's 215 pesos. 150 to 215 pesos in 1970. Today, it's 288,000 pesos.
Wow.
That's 1,330x increase.
Yep.
That's more than 10 times the US dollars in terms of devaluation. So our devaluation has accelerated 10x compared to the dollars. And all this time while I was in America, every time we were going to print money, every time they were going to issue stimulus or lower the interest rates and do quantitative easing, that was always good news for us as an investor, right? Because you knew your assets were going to double. During COVID, our real estate prices practically doubled.
Yep.
Right? And that's because, you know, the US is the only country that can do that. The US, they can actually print money at will and export their hyperinflation to other countries, or export their inflation to other countries like us who we import. So this is kind of waking up the world to how the global world order is destabilizing. And, you know, it's pretty interesting because we haven't really learned our lesson. This happened 5 times in history. And, you know, we've just kind of really been a price taker of this, and we haven't built our own energy sovereignty in this country. And so I do content about this, and, you know, honestly, like, I get called all the time in the comments, like, you're a Chinese spy, you're promoting China. Absolutely not. I'm American. Most of my investment is in US dollars.
Right.
So when the US wins, when they do quantitative easing, when they print money, as long as you own assets, you are winning.
Yep.
But you can see on the other side how this is taking an impact on the Philippines economy, especially with food and inflation.
So just to correct a misconception about you, you're not Chinese. Your ethnicity is Vietnamese.
No, I am Chinese.
You are? I thought you were Vietnamese.
I'm Chinese. My family, we left China after my grandparents left China.
Oh,
After,
Dang is Chinese.
Deng,
Dang.
right?
I thought it was
So,
Vietnam.
well, hear me out. My family, my grandparents left China during the Cultural Revolution, and they migrated to Vietnam, just like a lot of the Phil-Chi.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Around
okay.
the same time, a lot of the Filipino Chinese migrated here to the Philippines. So we migrated to Vietnam, and then after the Vietnam War, my family migrated
To the US.
Yes.
Okay. So you're Vietnamese Chinese.
Yes.
Like I'm Filipino Chinese.
Right.
But I consider myself Filipino.
I consider myself Chinese American.
Oh, you do? Oh, not Vietnamese American.
Well, because even though I was born there, I don't really speak it.
Right. Interesting. Okay. So John, I wanted to also touch on a couple of things you mentioned. So you said that the Philippine pesos devalued quite a bit compared to the gold,
Right.
right? The gold price. So in other words, if you look at it, the way to hedge against this inflation would have been to put your money in gold.
Exactly.
Because that would have been the best hedge if you had done it in the 1970s to today.
Exactly.
No matter what, you would have been ahead of everyone.
Right. Exactly.
Wow. Okay. Even if you were in the States, even if you were holding dollars, it would still be a better hedge putting it in gold.
Absolutely. And every time these oil crises happen, every time war broke out, what was the safe haven?
Gold.
Gold.
Right.
Right.
I mean, we're at all-time high levels right now.
Right.
It's
Exactly.
ridiculous where we're at. Okay, but do you believe that the reason why gold is making a comeback, because for the longest time, gold was kind of flat, right? The reason it's making a comeback right now is also because people are losing faith in the global reserve currency, which is the US dollar.
Absolutely. It's not just people, it's central banks.
Oh, central banks, countries,
Right.
states.
So think about it this way. When US kind of sanctioned Russia,
Yeah, that was, yeah.
when Russia invaded Ukraine, basically US and the G7 basically took away
Their reserves, their money.
their reserves, right? So imagine if you're a country like the Philippines and you have to buy all this oil from the US, you need a US reserve currency, right? But you don't just have US dollars, you have US treasuries, right? So all of this need to have a US reserve currency increases the demand for US treasuries, right? And so this is how the government in the US can continue to print money, right? And so anyways, when they saw, well, you know what? The US, at any time, if they don't like what you're doing, they can sanction you. So this woke up a lot of countries. A lot of countries were like, shoot, like, I better have my own,
Yep.
I better have my own backup. So they started like de-dollarization or decoupling from the dollar and started buying gold. And there's been more buying of gold from the central banks than ever before. And
Yep.
that's what's really driving the price of.
Right. Okay. And also other assets.
Right.
Yeah, but more importantly, aside from the fact that they sanctioned Russia, and not only did they sanction Russia, remember, so by sanctioning, they took away all the dollars that Russia was holding, right?
Right.
Okay, on top of that, this war has pretty much, that's the next nail in that coffin for the US dollar as a reserve currency. Because now the US is acting like a rogue nation. They're not acting like the global police. They're acting like I mean, some people would say they're acting like terrorists right now.
They're acting.
Right? They've invaded two sovereign states,
Right.
right? They started with Venezuela and now with Iran. And even before Iran, Trump was talking about Greenland annexing Canada. I mean, those kinds of conversations and leaving NATO
Right.
make people lose faith in the US dollar because their faith in the US dollar is tied to the US having a certain amount of sanity that goes along with it. That's not there anymore.
Right.
Now, what happens to the states and what happens to investors when the world, I believe, will be de-dollarized soon? U.S. will not be the global reserve currency very soon.
Well, if they continue as is, it's going to be threatening the US dollar dominance for sure.
More, yeah.
Because I just recently, for example, we had to go to Russia to buy oil, but we needed an exception from the US. India went directly to Russia and bought oil without asking permission, and they got
got
hit
sanctioned.
They got hit with tariffs, right?
Oh yeah.
We got an exception, so we had permission from the States to buy Russian oil.
Right. Okay.
And so what does that do? Now we don't buy Russian oil in US dollars, do we?
No, we don't.
Right? So we buy it in, so you and I was talking about this. It's an interesting system because now you can buy oil in yuan, but you can't actually buy yuan's not globally traded, right? So you have to buy it from them in gold, right?
Yeah.
Through
Because
some
they don't accept
intermediaries.
dollars.
Yeah. So they're China's essentially exchanging oil for gold.
Wow. Oh wow.
So this creates a little. This is going to give China a bit more leverage, and depending on who you ask, right? So you have people who are really patriotic, and they're like, well, Iran was, getting to a point where they can build a nuclear bomb, and that can't happen, right?
That's debatable, but yes, I get your
That's debatable because yes, exactly. And they said the same thing in Iraq.
point. Right. And it turns out
There
wasn't
right.
even true. Okay.
Exactly. And so that's the scary part is, at any point, if you're a sovereign nation, and at any point they could say, well, we think you're developing a nuclear weapon. So that is our reason to invade you, right? Does that make you, imagine Iran right now, right? And the president just tweeted out that, or made threats of annihilating your entire population.
Yep.
And if we get through this conflict, is Iran less likely or more likely going to pursue nuclear weapons? What would you do if you're a sovereign nation?
More likely pursue getting nuclear weapons.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's almost like once you achieve that status, it's almost like countries can't invade you.
Right. They're going to be, more yeah, exactly. That's why, which is why Trump will never challenge Russia
Right.
or China
Exactly.
or other, nuclear states.
Exactly.
Right?
Right. So when we talk about the world order, what are we talking about? We're talking about military power, right? Because right now we have the US and NATO who polices the world. And recently, NATO hasn't been following the US, right?
Yeah.
So usually the general of the US gets to tell the generals of all these other
What to do.
what to do, right? But now that this conflict has happened, countries are not following Donald Trump and the US into the wars. And the dangerous part right now is the US is on the verge of sending troops into Iran. And if that happens, this is going to take us back to similar to the Vietnam conflict. Right?
Oh, wow.
So the dangers of this is that right now we're in a situation that we might be able to pull out of this. We might be able to negotiate out of this. But as soon as American troops go in there and they die,
that changes the equation right there.
that changes the equation. And a lot of the European leaders, they are not willing to send their troops in there.
Yep.
Because once you send your troops in there and your troops die, you almost have to double down.
Yeah.
Because there is going to be a percentage of the population that supports the troop, and they're like, well, troops aren't going to die for nothing, right? We need to see this through,
Yeah.
right? And so that's the dangers of this war. It can get us into a long conflict, a 10, 20-year conflict. What happens, what's going to happen to the global economy when that happens?
So when you talk about the world economy right now, I think what's happening with the U.S. right now in the government, the United States government, is that all countries are hedging against it right now. All countries, all of their allies are now looking at other, whether it's China, possibly even Russia, each other, they're trying to create trade now with all other countries aside from the US. And US is getting isolated from the world economy by choice. Right? Now, how does that affect investments overall? Because US is still the biggest financial capital in the world. Right? The New York Stock Exchange, a lot of the big companies are being traded. Treasuries are still in US dollars. But I do know that, I'm not sure if this is a factor or not, but aren't some countries already maybe selling off their US treasuries at this point? Or maybe they're not even buying new ones already?
Well, so remember we were talking about the world order. There's two parts. Actually, military is one. The second is like economically, and the U.S. reserve currency is a big part of that, right? So that is being destabilized as we speak, right? Because this whole thing. Let's face it. A lot of this stems from economic warfare, or it's not economic warfare. It's really a race between U.S. and China right now, right?
Right.
And so, what happens if the U.S. and the Western world lets China become the dominant superpower? Because China's main interest isn't to police the world militarily.
Yep.
Their only interest is their own economic prosperity.
Right.
And the way they do it is they control supply chains.
Yep.
They become the world's manufacturer.
Yep.
Which is a threat for us as well, not just the U.S. Because, where are we going to find our growth if we can't manufacture anything because China is ultra competitive and they own the entire supply chain, right? And so it's a threat to a lot of countries in terms of their economic power.
So right now you're talking about China and the U.S. And China doesn't need to lift a finger right now with what's happening. They're just letting U.S. basically implode on its own bad decisions. And China is just waiting in the wings to be able to accept all new trades. And that's what they're doing. They're balancing it out. The U.S. is, committing war. And China is just waiting for the economic fallout from what they're doing. And the U.S. is feeling the economic fallout. China is feeling it positively as well. There's a lot more trade happening between China and Canada, where Canada used to be was closely tied to the U.S. I remember there was the issue with Huawei and the spies, and at one point they were going to be banning certain things, but now Canada has opened up to China, where BYD is now going to be available in Canada in big numbers, where Americans can't get BYD.
Yeah.
Right? For security reasons, they say. Right. Honestly, I don't think it's security reasons. I think it's more they just want to be able to keep people with the Teslas, right?
Yeah. So let me ask you, what do you think is the U.S.'s superpower when it comes to the economy?
Wow. What is your superpower when it comes
what is the U.S.'s biggest advantage in the world when it comes to their economic power?
Their stock market? I don't know.
Yes, which is also driven by the dollars, right?
Right.
Strong dollar drives their financial markets, right? Also their innovation, right?
Yep.
Right, and then also mostly their U.S. dollar gives them a lot of strength. And if this conflict is pushing people out of the petrodollar, China wins big, right? Because now all of a sudden you're buying in yuan, petrodollars, and then now China wins the trade in manufacturing.
Yep.
Then you can see a shift. I think, I'm not saying it's going to happen anytime soon. I think we have a long ways to go. I think the U.S. still has a lot of financial leverage, right? It's not just the petrodollar. They have the world's largest financial system, right? So the world's equity goes into the U.S. financial markets, right?
Right.
Private equity, the stock market, by far the most liquid markets in the world.
Yep.
Right. And so how does China compete against that, right? And like you said, U.S. creating this conflict is making other countries realign with China, or even the Philippines might look at China in a different way now.
Yes. So so that's a good point. For Philippines right now, we have our conflicts with China when it comes to the West Philippine Sea.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it's more nuanced than that, because we do have a lot of trade with China as well right now as we speak. China, I think if I remember correctly, we have a lot of exports to China, which they need badly. Bananas,
Right.
mangoes, and what coconut oil. There's a lot of different products that we do export to
Right.
China that they need badly, and we also get a lot of products from China. But I think this what's happening in the U.S. is making us rethink about how we do trade with China, but we still keep our position with the West Philippine Sea.
Right.
Because you can have an argument on one aspect and still be able to conduct business on the other aspect. Sometimes Filipinos don't see it that way. They believe if you're going to fight on the West Philippine Sea, you shouldn't be doing trade with China. What's your view on that? And how do you think we're going to be able to resolve this, or at least be able to balance it out?
What I was asking myself, like, why is China picking a fight with the Philippines over the West China Sea, right? And it's something, is it, you know, it's creating a conflict they don't need, right? But if you think about it, if you think about the geographic location, and you're seeing what happens during with now the Strait of Hormuz.
Yep.
If China's, if they get Taiwan, right? If you have Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, South Korea, you can control all the maritime trade
Exactly.
and the imports to the oil. And that is a huge threat to China. And that is what this is about. I believe that's
Sure,
what
it's a
this is.
huge threat to China.
It's a huge threat to China because China imports all their oil, and you see what's happening with the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
We never really thought about it.
But at the same time, remember the Strait of Hormuz was always open.
Right.
It was never closed, except today when Iran realized, wait a minute, I can hold it hostage because of what the U.S. is doing. Now the U.S. doubled down and said, no, we're going to hold it hostage too.
So the world, like, strategic leaders understand this. They know the value of these maritime trade
Yes.
routes, right? Like, for example, who's a big threat? China taking over Taiwan, for example. You know who the biggest threat that is to? That's the biggest threat that is to is Japan. Japan also relies on that trade route, right? And so now Japan is getting involved in this too, and they're like, well, we want to defend Taiwan, and now Japan's militarizing.
Yeah. And even South Korea.
Yeah.
Yeah, but okay. So in that aspect, so I just wanted to clarify: China isn't just picking a fight with the Philippines. China is picking a fight with all its Southeast Asian neighbors, all of us.
Right.
Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, everyone, and all other Asian countries, Thailand,
Right.
Japan, South Korea. They're picking a fight with everyone. What the irony is, what I'm seeing is now there's we're calling China invaders because they have militarized bases around the Philippines on the West Philippine Sea. And then they're trying to control the maritime rights of that area where they shouldn't be. It's supposed to be open for everyone, right?
Yeah.
And then you see the U.S. blockading the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly.
The irony and the hypocrisy of
Exactly.
that, where they block it and yet they're now saying, no, China, you can't police this.
Right.
I'm not defending China. I'm just saying that there's such hypocrisy in the U.S. saying this is supposed to be an open seas and everyone should be able to pass through. And China's been trying to do that, and now U.S. is doing it
Right.
in the Middle East. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah.
try to wrap my head around it, John.
So-
I mean, I don't know.
I think this is a big eye opener because we knew about the maritime trade routes and we knew how important it was, but it wasn't really that big of a threat until now. Now it's like more prominent than ever to have your own country's sovereignty. You need to have safe trade.
Yeah, but when it comes to the West Philippine Sea, for example, the problem with that is China is militarily a lot more powerful than the Philippines or any of its Southeast Asian neighbors. So can they just bully us into blockading in a way the West Philippine Sea and the entire area?
I don't know, but I do think they have the naval power to do so when they're obviously compared to Japan, they have the second biggest navy
Yep.
in the world, right? And I think they have more ships and destroyers and carriers than the U.S. now because they manufacture this stuff.
Right.
So they definitely have the capabilities. Whether they would do it is
Right. I was gonna say, but then the argument that people make for China is that they've never done it.
right.
Well, at least not from my knowledge. They've never done it. So would they do it or not? I don't think they will. I think they're playing the long game, and I think they're fighting economically. That's how they can maintain control with with the finance rather than militarily.
Right.
And I think that's where the game is.
You mean they haven't done it like when it comes to Taiwan or
Right.
taking over?
Yeah, they've been
sides?
threatening, but
Yeah.
they've never done it.
Right.
But so the other question that I wanted to answer when you asked was, why is China interested in the Philippines? For several reasons. So number one is our vicinity to Taiwan. We have U.S. bases that are literally just south of Taiwan. You could, it's so close to Taiwan
right.
that Taiwanese actually fly into the Philippines or even
Right.
take the boat on the tip of the on the tip of Luzon. That's how close it is.
Right.
So that's one. So they don't like that proximity of U.S. bases to Taiwan
Yeah.
because they know that that's a landing and a defense position of the U.S. and of Taiwan.
Right.
So that's what they're trying. That's why they're trying to push Philippines away from the U.S. So that's one. The other one is natural resources.
Yes.
Philippines is massive with natural resources,
Yes.
from gas to oil to wow, so many minerals.
Critical minerals, right? It's another
Yeah,
one. Yeah.
it's huge.
Right.
Now, the problem is they can't just bully their way into getting it, and that's what they're trying to do.
But if you don't believe that's a big enough motivator, just look at what happened with Russia and Ukraine, right?
Oh,
So as NATO moves into Ukraine, Russia has been warning against this, and they're like, well, if don't do this because we're gonna have to really step in, right? And understandably so, because if Russia or China were to put missiles in Mexico, U.S. will go into all-out war against that, right? And so you have to understand these countries that are that big and powerful. They're going to protect.
you know when you said that, when Russia said, "Oh, don't bring Ukraine into NATO or else," right? That sounds like the U.S. saying, "Oh, Iran, you have nuclear weapons, so therefore we're gonna,
Right.
invade."
Yeah.
It's such it's a weak argument for me. Of them,
Right.
both are weak arguments, and both are just excuses to be able to invade, which both have done. They're both guilty of that, and I think U.S. is no better than Russia when Russia invaded Ukraine. U.S. is no better in terms of invading Iran. They do have one, if there was one redeeming factor, is if they did that regime change that they were saying they were going to do, but they never did because they didn't really have a plan or a.
What regime change? Iran.
In
Iranian-
Iran.
Oh, okay. So they cut off the head and they said, well, the people is going to topple the government, right?
That's what they were thinking.
Right.
That's what they were stupidly thinking, which wasn't going to happen, right? But you just emboldened them. So what I'm saying is the reason for them invading Iran and the reason for Russia invading Ukraine, Russia said so that they don't become part of NATO. Now, because of this, they're now closer to becoming part of NATO. If not, I think did they already sign? And are they now part of NATO? I don't remember,
they're not.
but they're close to it because now NATO's saying, you know what, the EU made them part of the EU now, which is one step closer to NATO now.
Yeah.
And now the US saying, we're doing this because you're building nuclear weapons. Now they're now really gonna build nuclear weapons because of what you're doing, you idiot.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, let's talk about the investment side of it.
Okay.
Now we're here in the Philippines. I mean, a lot of Filipinos are watching this going, how do I protect myself from all this, the price of oil going up, the peso going to 60 pesos to the dollar? That's insane. That just accelerates the inflation right now with this devaluation of the peso. What is a good way for Filipinos to be able to protect themselves, and what are good investment strategies?
Well, I think the first thing you gotta think is, do you have to be all in pesos? Can you diversify into dollars, for example? So I think if you can earn in dollars, that's very helpful. Like if you can, a lot of people, earn in dollars and they transfer into peso, keep it in dollars. That's one simple thing. And then, obviously you can diversify into dollar assets, right? You can also diversify into gold. You could also diversify into mining industries in the Philippines. Like, for example, the biggest winner is, I think, Oceana Gold. I forgot the exact name, but it's a mining company in the Philippines.
Okay, it's a
that's done
Filipino company?
Yeah, it's done. So during this whole time, we've been taking a huge hit in the PSE. Oceana Gold has been one of the biggest winners, the biggest winners, because they're a gold mining operation. And if you really think about this, it's not just gold. The world is reshuffling out, and they're rotating capital out of tech and SaaS, because tech is now becoming commoditized with AI. Now it's going into the infrastructure of AI. And you think about, it's not just the infrastructure of AI. You think about solar panels, EVs, the electrification of the world. You think about the AI infrastructure, the amount of critical minerals it takes, and the amount of energy it takes. So critical minerals, and by the way, an AI data center, for example, takes 5 times as much copper as a regular data center, right? And now you have, for example, now you have the innovation of robotics.
Right.
You think about all the materials are needed. So the world is shifting. And the interesting thing was, we always talk about Bitcoin, and I'm a big Bitcoin believer, and Bitcoin was perfect for quantitative easing. It was the perfect solution for quantitative easing. But nowadays, the problem with Bitcoin is it's dead capital. It's just sitting there. It's not being productive. It's not producing a yield for you. But now, if you think about, mining commodities, anywhere where we're like resource driven, if you believe that the world is going to be more in need of resource, and by the way, because of this geopolitical tension, China is using it as a weapon. They're cutting off supply chains of critical minerals, for example. They're cutting off supply chains to the U.S. They're threatening Japan. And U.S. has done the same thing with their trade war, with chips and things like that, cutting China off chips. So you are seeing countries starting to cut each other off as economic warfare and leverage.
Right.
And countries now need to start thinking about their own sovereignty. So I believe, after this whole AI disruption that's going to happen, where is the Philippines going to find their growth? Where is the growth going to come from? Well, I still think what you just mentioned, Philippines is still rich in natural resources, but we don't refine any of those resources.
Yes.
We ship them out to China, and China refines it for us.
Yep.
That needs to change.
Yep.
And I think I think now there's going to be a political will to change that. So the question is, can the Philippines extract its own resources, refine those resources, and build manufacturing on top of that?
And then sell it to the world.
Right. And the other big one is energy. We know energy prices are going to continue to rise. Who are the big winners? Energy companies. Right. And so their margins go up automatically when supply drops.
So, okay. So for me, what you said about Bitcoin, I think Bitcoin is still a good investment to make. Why? Because when you talk about everything you mentioned are commodities. Gold is a commodity. Mining companies is based on commodities. Bitcoin is the commodity of tech.
Yes.
It is the driver of tech. When you talk about being able to tokenize all that energy, that electrification of energy, right? To be able to store it, Bitcoin is that store of value for energy. So in that sense, Bitcoin actually is a good investment to make. Now, I also wanted to add that uranium, I believe, is going to be massive. It's going to see a massive spike in its price not because of nuclear weapons, because of energy.
Nuclear power.
Yeah, nuclear power.
Exactly.
That is going to be big.
And then it's not just uranium, it's silver, right? All the solar panels require a ton of silver, right?
There.
Copper. You think about the energy infrastructure that is needed in this whole AI revolution. Not to mention Bitcoin requires a lot of energy, right?
You're right.
So all this energy is needed, and you need copper to build all that infrastructure and all this robotics. That's going to require a lot of copper.
Right.
And so you can go down the list, and all the critical minerals for batteries. You can think about those things too. And so the world is shifting towards like investments are shifting away from tech and more into commodities. Even countries are, for example, China is selling off their treasury bonds and investing in, critical minerals,
Right.
right? And so that's smart. That's smart. It's like it has more of a basis to back up your currency, for
Right.
example.
Yeah. Especially right now with what they're doing with gold.
Right.
I mean, by buying gold, they're really actually storing that value in something that holds value versus just holding dollar reserves, which is what's going to happen. Now, you mentioned, which is ironic for me because you mentioned that don't hold your money in pesos if you can avoid it, then hold it in dollars, even though the dollar is already, we're seeing the de-dollarization of the world. Okay, that sounds like a short-term plan.
It's a short-term plan. You're right. But long-term, I wouldn't hold any fiat currency, right? Like
You don't hold any fiat.
I think you minimize it as much as possible.
Right.
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 Because why is that? Well, right now the U.S. has approximately $40 trillion of debt.
Yeah.
Right. And so their interest payment is growing faster than their economy. Right. So at some point that debt becomes unsustainable. So what is the U.S.'s plan to, we've talked about this, like what is the U.S.'s plan to handle this national debt? Because there's no other solution but to continue to print more money.
Yes.
And when governments around the world and people around the world is not buying the U.S. Treasury
Right.
bonds,
Anymore.
how then do you do it? Because there's no other answer but to print more money.
And then what if not only are they not, because of what's happening, two things are going to happen. They're going to stop buying the U.S. treasuries and they're going to start redeeming the treasuries they currently hold. That could collapse the U.S. economy.
So your bond yields are right now the bond market is taking a hit. Even if the U.S. Federal Reserve is going to decide to lower interest rate,
Right.
the bond yields still might be high and they might not be able to effectively lower the interest rate because nobody wants the bonds.
Right.
Right. So when nobody wants the bond yields go up, interest rates stay high. Right. So what happens when the bond market collapses? Right. So this is a big question. And so I think what you're seeing happening around the world is US's play to address this. Part of it is protecting the petrodollar. Right. That's part of it. Because if they lose the petrodollar, that's a huge detriment to the U.S. economy and their ability to print money and the ability to control fiscal policies.
Yeah, and the ability to export inflation.
Exactly.
So for a lot of our viewers, a lot of people don't understand the impact of U.S. policy on inflation, on global inflation. And right now, the biggest problem, I think, we're talking about the oil crisis, but what we just touched on is the global debt crisis, not just the U.S., but all over the world.
All over the world.
Wow,
yeah.
we are heavily leveraged if you think about it. Philippines alone, our national debt is at 18 trillion already.
60% of its GDP, right?
Yeah, that is crazy. But then again, people don't make sense of these numbers because they say 60% of their GDP. Yeah, but then look at Japan. It's over 100%. Look at the U.S. I think it's over 100% as well. And other developed countries with higher GDP to debt ratio. Why are you concerned about 60% to debt GDP ratio? Why should we be concerned?
Well, here's the interesting thing. 30% of our national debt in the Philippines is denominated in U.S. dollars. So when we're going through times like this, when the oil crisis is causing us to pay more in pesos for every barrel of dollar, that is devaluing our currency. On top of that, if interest rate goes up, we're paying for that national debt in more pesos. So for example, in 1970, if they borrowed $1 billion at 6.7 peso to the dollar, it would have taken us 6.7 trillion to pay in tax revenues to pay that off.
Right.
Now you know how government debt works. It gets refinanced, restructured, it gets kicked down the road. And we're still probably paying a lot of that national debt off. Now we're paying at 60 peso per dollar. So now that 1 billion in national debt is now 60 billion pesos
1 billion.
yeah.
So it's six. So it'd be 1 billion. It would be 10 billion.
Yeah. No, 1 billion now is 60 billion in pesos.
Oh yeah,
So
the
$1
1
billion
billion, right.
in debt is
Right.
60 billion
Which
peso.
used to be only 6 point something
Seven, yeah.
billion.
Yes.
Right. Wow.
so-
oh my God.
So, but I don't think the Philippines is at critical risk like other countries at. You have Japan that's borrowed what, like, 100 and both Japan and US are around like 120, 150% of its GDP. The two countries that have been able to print money at will is Japan and the US.
Right.
The way Japan does it is because they've been at 0% interest rate. They haven't had to
Yes.
sell their bonds to anybody. The Central Bank of Japan buys its own bonds.
Yes.
Right. And so it's like I borrow to myself and I print money to buy from myself. And so this is, as long as they didn't see hyperinflation, they can continue to do that. And the reason why they didn't see hyperinflation is because they basically exported asset inflation around the world. Because at the time, everybody can borrow. Financial institutions can borrow Japanese yen at 0%, invest it in the U.S. Treasury bonds, get a 5%
Right.
risk-free rate,
Yeah.
and profit from that. And so it was like free money.
Yep.
And so that's why they didn't see a huge amount of inflation. And also they had decades of economic recovery as well.
Okay. So yeah, with Japan, well, they were the global lender.
Right.
Right. For the longest time. But I don't know how long they're going to be they're going to keep doing that because of what's happening right now. But beyond that, okay, so let's go back to the Filipino investor. John, you're based in the Philippines now, right? And you're I don't know how your investment strategy is compared to a Filipino, what your access is, because Filipinos may not have access to all the investment opportunities that you have. So I wanted to touch on a couple of things. Number one, locally, the ones that are accessible to Filipinos. Is property a good investment to make right now, given the oil crisis and the global crisis happening right now?
Well, I know people have coined me as the real estate guy here, but I have not ever pushed Philippine real. I've not encouraged people to buy Philippine real estate. I don't think Philippines real estate is a good investment. I would argue unless you're at the point where you're developing land and building big developments, I think you capture most of the upside.
But if you're
if you're land banking, you're Filipino, you're land banking, you can capture some upside there. But if you're like buying condos, for example,
Right.
buying properties here as an individual investor, more than likely, especially condos, it's a depreciating asset. If I was a local Filipino, I would be looking at diversifying into things like crypto, into gold, into companies that are going to benefit from this whole market shifts.
Right.
And by the way, I'm actually putting a percentage of my portfolio into the Philippine stock market.
Oh.
Yeah. So I'm heavily diversified out of the US. I live in the Philippines. I believe that you should have some portion of your income coming from the country, from the local economy, from investments here in the Philippines. So I am investing in the Philippines. And the interesting thing about the Philippines is, it's the only country I see, or any stock market I see, that pays a consistent 6 to 8 to 10% dividend. That's quite high.
Wow.
Yeah. So I get a lot of skepticism for this, by the way. People think the Philippine stock market is an equity trap or a value trap. Well, the thing with the Philippines economy is very different than, so when you make investments in the Philippines, it's very different from the US. In the US, you can invest in some things like ETF. Like if you believe the defense industry is going to blow up, you just buy a defense ETF and the whole industry rises. In the Philippines, it's very much controlled by one company.
Right.
Every industry is largely in control, dominated by one monopoly or two companies at most. And so these guys, I don't think are going to go anywhere.
Right.
You still need a local economy. You still need distribution. You still are going to have local players. And who are going to disrupt the big players? Who are going to disrupt the oligarchs here? Right? If anything, they're going to get more profitable with the advent of AI.
Right.
And so the interesting thing, and this isn't just in the Philippines, this is everywhere around the world. And I think it's so important that people understand they need to be investing now
Yes.
more than ever,
Yes.
because for the first time in the world, first time ever, we're seeing a divergence of employment. Employment is going down, and corporate profits and stock prices are going up. Why is that?
Yeah, because AI.
AI.
Yeah.
Right? And so automation and AI is going to take people out of the workforce. And so if you're in the position where you need to work, you know, they call this the K-shaped economy.
Okay.
Right? So what is the K-shaped economy? The K-shaped economy means that if you own assets, you're going to become richer and richer.
Yep.
If you don't have assets and you're trading your time for money, you're going to become poorer and poorer, right? And I think that's true around the world.
Yep.
That's not just in the US. That's here in the Philippines as well, right? And so the key now, it's more important now than ever to own assets because, you know, yeah, you could say, well, you know, with AI, I'm going to have all these tools and I'm build all these companies and I'm build all these startups. And well, guess what? Everyone's doing the same thing. Again, it's going to get commoditized.
Okay, but when you say you know the ones that own the assets are going to get richer and richer, what assets are you talking about? Let's actually give me five.
Well,
Do you have five or three? Top three.
I'm not against real estate. Real estate is supposed to be inflation proof.
Right.
Okay. Real estate is inflation proof. I invest in real estate. I invest in equities, U.S. equities, and hopefully, you know, hopefully in the Philippines soon. I invest in crypto, and I invest in gold. And you know,
okay. All right, that's interesting. But for me, do you believe that, or aren't you afraid that investing in the Philippine stock market, right, with a Philippine-denominated company, would be slightly risky, given that the Philippine peso has been devalued and is continuously being devalued?
well, do we know if the Philippines peso is going to continuously be devalued?
Well, if we look at history, throughout history,
Right.
yes.
Against the dollar,
against the dollar, right.
dollar is going to be a
Yes.
lose situation, right?
Right.
So I still think, you know, there's also a chance that this can go in reverse. You never know. The thing is, when you invest, you always invest for the worst case scenario. This is the point of diversification. If everything else collapses, let's say the US dollar collapse, which I don't think it will. Let's just say, for example, all of my investment is in the US. The dollar collapses. Well, now maybe the peso is the gainer of that, is the winner of that. And so the point of diversifying is, you know, if everything else fails, I still have a safety net,
Right.
right? And same thing with gold and Bitcoin. When catastrophe happens, why is Bitcoin better than gold, for example?
It's just easier, more portable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? In case, you know, we need to flee our country.
Right.
We can't take our gold with us necessarily.
Yep.
Right? So we have Bitcoin, right? And so again, it's these scenarios that I know it's like maybe these doomsday scenario, but you always plan for that, right?
Right.
That's the point of diversifying and that's the point of hedging against your bet. When the markets collapse on one side, you have an insurance policy on the other side, right?
Speaking of insurance policy, do you have an insurance policy?
Health insurance or life insurance?
Life insurance? Do you have any insurance investments?
No, but I should. I should.
You should.
You should.
Okay. Why?
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of insurance that works as an investment, like annuities, for example, right? And at some point when you're accumulating so much wealth, right? And let's say, have you heard of like family offices or family trusts, right?
Right.
Like let's take the Rockefeller, for example.
Okay.
The Rockefeller family, for example. What they do is brilliant. The Rockefeller family is a family trust. And if you're born into that trust, you get the same benefits. Now, every family member has a life insurance policy. Well, guess what? And instead of taking equity out, they borrow against their assets. And you and I talk about this. If you have enough assets, you could borrow for very cheap. And why wouldn't you borrow? Because you know you're on one hand, your equities and your assets are growing. You have some interest rates, but it's covered by the growth of your assets anyway. So essentially, the Rockefeller family, they borrow when they need that money. When they die, that insurance policy pays it out and pays off the
Wow.
right,
Wait,
and it
you're
injects
saying
the
that-
liquidity back into the
Right.
trust.
I didn't know that a trust can actually be a beneficiary for insurance. Oh, that's very interesting. Now I'm thinking about what I should be doing. But then insurance is also for people that have a family, right? If you're single, might not make sense because you don't really have a beneficiary or a dependent or somebody that that would benefit from you dying.
Well, when you're accumulating wealth, right?
Right.
The point, why do we accumulate wealth? It's because one point, when we're first starting off, let's say we're working in our careers, we're becoming successful, why do we invest? We invest because we know at some point we can't trade our time for money anymore.
Right.
We need our wealth to earn for us, to take care of us. And at some point, it goes beyond just you.
Right.
You're thinking about your legacy. You're thinking about passing on your wealth that you've accumulated. Because once you've accumulated a certain amount of wealth, your assets are, you don't really need to work anymore. Your assets are taking care of you. Your assets are continuing to grow. Like you're not going to spend that much money. How much money can you spend?
Right.
At some point, you're going to be thinking about, how to. You could give it to an NGO and build a good
Right.
cause out of it. You can create an NGO out of your trust, or you can give it to your family members irresponsibly, just hand them over the money and they have to pay a bunch of taxes on it. Or you build this entity, this empire that actually continues to grow that investment
Wow.
like a company and pays its family members dividends from generation to generation.
Oh,
Right?
okay. And for the average everyday Filipino, okay, not the Rockefellers, for the average ones, John, I want to know if let's say somebody is still making regular income, not passive income, what is a good strategy and what kind of time frame are you looking at where you go from active income and then the portion that should be passive income and how do you grow it and how long should it take?
The hardest thing is your first 1 million or whatever. I always said the hardest was your first million.
Whether it's pesos,
When
dollars.
you're actively working, it's just that first million is going to be the hardest part.
Okay.
Once you make your first million, it's easy to double that through the right decisions, right? And so I think the question is like if you're working, if you're
Yes.
you're just like an everyday
Yes,
employee,
good strategy to be able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you're making 50,000 pesos a month. Okay, 50. Oh, can I go 100? Okay, let's say it's 100,000 pesos a month. Okay, so with your expenses and everything, what's a good amount to be able to put in and then invest and then to grow it so that you can eventually get to a point where hopefully that investment turns into passive income and that it can replace your active income. That's the goal, right? We go from active income, replace it with passive income.
You can think about ways to earn passive income. Real estate could be a passive income, but I don't think you could do it when you're just starting off with 100,000 pesos a month.
Yep.
I would invest in business ideas. And I'm not saying go and invest in the most riskiest assets, right? There are all sorts of altcoins that will promise you, 10,000%, but your chances of losing that money is probably very likely, right?
But at the same time, I think if you had 100,000 for me, putting aside 10%, 10,000 a month. I know it's small, but that 10,000 a month, putting in the right investments, commodities, gold, Bitcoin, even stocks, picking the right stocks or index funds, putting it there, 10,000 a month, 120,000 a year, 2 years is 240. Let's say, just imagine, I know it sounds slow, right? But when you're at 240,000, and then that, remember, once it's invested, actually say grows another 50%, right? So from 240, it's actually 360, but you're putting another 120, where you're now at 480. So you see how it can start to compound.
Exactly.
Right? So that's the power of that. And if you're starting off, and let's say you're in your 20s or 30s, by the time you hit to 40, you'll probably get to your first million. That first million in reinvested actually can generate that second million.
See, you're absolutely right. Like the benefit of people doing that is then they start adopting the mindset.
The mindset, right? The
And once they
discipline.
understand the compound growth, you could borrow a lot of money and then see compound interest rates wipe you out.
Yep.
and put you into poverty, but it can work in the other way. You can start to see how even using leverage can compound your growth. Learning how to save on taxes will compound your growth. Investing in the market where it earns while you sleep will compound your growth. That's very important. I did the opposite. I didn't make my first investment until I was like 38 or 39, right? And so I spent all of my, and I knew about it. I was a finance major. I knew I had to invest my money. I knew about the stock market. I knew about the real estate market. You know, and I even got into crypto early. But the thing is, I invested everything into my own abilities so that I can become wealth. So I could be an entrepreneur that succeeded. So my most important first step was to be an entrepreneur, a successful entrepreneur. And if I did that, I knew I would have enough discretionary income to just watch my wealth grow simply by making the right decisions.
Yep. And it looks like you've made the right decisions, John. And I do wish you the best in the coming years now that we're in the time where I call this the accumulation phase, where this is the time to invest, like you said. When there's a crisis, it's the best time to invest.
Exactly.
And that's the advice I'm going to make for everyone right now, is especially when you talk about, commodities, Bitcoin. Wow, putting it now can yield a pretty big result in the next 2 to 3 years. With that, John, thank you for your time. We're actually at an hour already. Can you believe that? We're almost at an hour.
I can't believe that.
So we talk so much. But John, thank you for your time today. And I hope people learned from John's wisdom and some of the tips he gave. And if you guys have any comments, agree or disagree with what John said, write in the comment section below. Do you also want to share your social media channels?
Yeah, so if you want to follow me, my channel is John Dang 808 on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook.
Awesome. John, with that, thanks so much for your time. And thanks for the viewers for watching. And we'll see you guys on the next episode.